They called him the bought husband. In the unforgiving Texas hill country of 1882, 24-year-old Caleb Turner stood at the altar beside Margaret Hale, a woman twice his age, a widow wrapped in black silk and colder silence. The church whispered. The town sneered. His own mother wept. This wasn't love. It was a transaction. Her money for his youth, her land for his dignity. As the preacher's words echoed through the wooden chapel, Caleb felt the weight of every judging eye, every cruel assumption. He was no longer a man. He was property. And the woman beside him, distant, unreadable, untouchable, offered nothing but the promise of a hollow, loveless existence. Before we begin, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this story moves you, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Now, let's step into Caleb and Margaret's world. The April sun beat down mercilessly on the limestone chapel, its white walls glaring against the scrubby hills that rolled endlessly toward the horizon. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cedar and judgment. Caleb Turner stood rigid in his only suit, threadbare at the elbows, too short in the sleeves, and fought the urge to run. Beside him, Margaret Hale stood like a monument. 46 years carved into the lines around her mouth, her spine straight as a rifle barrel, her hands gloved in black lace despite the heat. She didn't look at him. Hadn't looked at him once since he'd arrived. Her eyes remained fixed on some point beyond the preacher's shoulder, as if she could will herself into another time, another place, another life entirely. The preacher droned on. Caleb heard none of it. The words dissolved into the humid air, meaningless as the dust motes drifting through the stained glass light. What he heard instead was the rustle of skirts as Mrs. Pritchard leaned toward Mrs. Morrison, the barely concealed snort from Samuel Brennan in the third pew, the sharp intake of breath from his own mother, sitting alone in the front row, her handkerchief pressed to her trembling lips. His father wasn't there. His father was 6 feet under, buried 3 months ago after the fever took him, buried owing more money than their 200 acres could ever be worth. That was why Caleb was here. That was why he was selling himself like livestock at auction. Margaret Hale owned 4,000 acres of the best grazing land in Kendall County. She owned the general store, half the bank, and the loyalty of every creditor who'd ever extended credit in these parts. She was wealthy beyond imagination for a woman in this harsh country. She was also utterly, devastatingly alone. Her first husband, old Edmund Hale, had died 5 years back. Her son, Thomas, had followed him into the grave just 18 months ago. An accident, they said. A terrible, senseless accident in the stable. 22 years old, bright as a new penny, destined to inherit everything. Gone in an instant. Margaret had withdrawn after that. Stopped attending church socials. Stopped making her weekly trips to town. Stopped, it seemed, living altogether. She'd become a ghost in her own sprawling house, and the town had begun to whisper that she'd lost her mind to grief. Then, 2 months ago, she'd done something that proved she hadn't lost her mind at all. She'd made Caleb's mother an offer. The Turner land sat adjacent to the Hale property. Prime bottomland along the creek, rich soil, good water. Edmund Hale had wanted it for years, but Caleb's father had refused every offer. Now, with the bank breathing down their necks and foreclosure looming, Margaret had presented a solution. She would buy the Turner debt, all of it. She would allow Caleb's mother to remain in the house for as long as she lived. The land would be absorbed into the Hale holdings, yes, but the family would be safe, secure, provided. In exchange, Caleb would marry her. He'd laughed when his mother first told him, laughed until he saw her face, gray with exhaustion, hollow with desperation. Then he'd stopped laughing. "It's not right," he'd said, his voice raw. "Mama, it's not right. I can't." "You can," she'd whispered. "You will, because there's no other way, Caleb. No other way to keep what your daddy built. No other way to keep me from the poorhouse." So here he stood, bought and paid for. A husband in name only, bound to a woman who looked at him the way one might regard a necessary but distasteful piece of furniture. "Do you, Caleb James Turner, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The words cut through his thoughts like a blade. Every eye in the chapel fixed on him. The silence stretched, taut as barbed wire. He forced himself to look at Margaret then. Really, look at her. Her profile was sharp against the light. Strong nose, firm chin, lips pressed into a bloodless line. Beautiful once, perhaps. Beautiful still, in the way a winter landscape could be beautiful, cold, remote, unyielding. "I do," he said. His voice didn't shake. He was grateful for that, at least. The preacher turned to Margaret. "And do you, Margaret Elizabeth Hale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." Her voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of a woman signing a business contract, nothing more. The preacher smiled, oblivious or indifferent to the suffocating tension in the room. "Then by the power vested in me by the state of Texas, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride." Caleb's stomach lurched. This, somehow, felt more impossible than everything that had come before. He turned toward Margaret, searching her face for any hint of what she wanted him to do. She met his eyes for the first time. Hers were gray, storm cloud gray, and completely, utterly empty. "That won't be necessary," she said quietly. Only he heard it. Then, louder, for the room. "Thank you, Reverend." She turned and walked down the aisle without waiting for him. The congregation sat frozen, unsure whether to stand, to clap, to do anything at all. Caleb followed her, his face burning, his hands clenched so tight his nails bit into his palms. Behind him, the whispers started immediately. Pathetic. Selling himself like a common, that poor woman, having to buy companionship. He'll bleed her dry, mark my words. She's lost her mind, marrying a boy young enough to be her son. Caleb kept walking, one foot in front of the other. Through the chapel doors into the blinding sunlight, Margaret was already climbing into her carriage, a fine black affair with velvet seats and a driver waiting with his eyes carefully averted. She didn't invite Caleb to join her. He stood there swaying slightly in the heat as she settled herself inside. The driver glanced at him, then at Margaret. "Ma'am?" the driver said uncertainly. "Take me home, Joseph," Margaret said. "But Mr. Turner will make his own way." The carriage rolled forward. Caleb watched it disappear down the dusty road, trailing a plume of yellow dust. His mother appeared at his elbow, her face streaked with tears. "It'll be all right," she whispered, squeezing his arm. "Give it time, son. Give it time." But as Caleb began the long, hot walk toward the Hale Ranch, toward his new home, his new life, his new cage, he couldn't imagine how time would ever make this right. The Hale house rose from the prairie like a fortress. 2 stories of whitewashed stone, wraparound porches on both levels, tall windows that gleamed like watchful eyes. Caleb had seen it from a distance his whole life, had admired its grandeur, its permanence. Now, approaching it on foot with his few belongings and a canvas sack over his shoulder, it looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The front door stood open. He climbed the steps slowly, his boots echoing on the wide planks. Inside, the house was cool and dim. Dark wood paneling, heavy furniture, oil paintings of stern-faced people he didn't recognize. Everything spoke of wealth, of history, of a world he had no part in. "Mrs. Hale?" he called. His voice fell into the silence like a stone into deep water. No response. He moved through the rooms cautiously. A formal parlor with stiff-backed chairs arranged around a cold fireplace. A dining room with a table that could seat 20. A library lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. Everything was immaculate. Everything was untouched. It felt like a museum, not a place where people actually lived. He found the kitchen at the back of the house. A woman stood at the stove, middle-aged, raw-boned, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. "You must be the new Mr. Hale," she said, the pause before his title speaking volumes. "Caleb Turner," he said. "Just Caleb is fine. I'm Mrs. Chen. I cook and keep house." She didn't offer her hand. "Your room is upstairs, 3rd door on the left. Mrs. Hale's room is the 1st door on the right. You do well to remember that." The meaning was clear. Stay away. "Where is she?" Caleb asked. "Where she always is this time of day. Her sitting room, 2nd floor, end of the hall. She doesn't like to be disturbed." "She's my wife now," Caleb said quietly. "Seems like I should at least know where she is." Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly. The marriage doesn't change who she is, boy. She's been alone in her grief a long time. Paper and words don't fix that. Caleb nodded slowly. He climbed the stairs, each step creaking despite the apparent quality of construction. The upstairs hallway was lined with more portraits. He paused at one. A young man with Margaret's eyes and a bright, confident smile. Thomas Hale, the golden son, the lost boy. The third door on the left opened into a spacious bedroom. A bed, a wardrobe, a washstand, a window overlooking the rolling hills. It was more luxury than Caleb had ever known, and it felt utterly foreign. He set his sack on the bed and stood there, uncertain what to do with himself. This was his wedding day. He should be, what? Celebrating? Consummating his marriage? The thought was absurd. Grotesque, even. Margaret had made her expectations abundantly clear without saying a word. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. He unpacked his meager belongings, 2 shirts, 1 pair of work trousers, his father's pocket watch, a small photograph of his parents on their wedding day. They'd been young, in love. His mother's smile in that faded image could have lit the whole prairie. Caleb set the photograph on the small table by the bed and sat down heavily. Through the open window, he could hear the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the new grass, the cry of a hawk circling overhead. Normal sounds. A normal spring day. But nothing about this was normal. He spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the grounds, staying well away from the main house. There were extensive gardens, now overgrown and wild, a chicken coop with a few listless hens, a massive barn, well-maintained but largely empty. Margaret didn't work her own cattle anymore. She leased the grazing rights to neighboring ranchers, and there, beyond the barn, half hidden by a stand of live oaks, he found the old stable. It was a ruin. The roof had partially collapsed, and what remained was blackened by fire. Weeds grew thick through the charred floorboards. A door hung crooked on broken hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze. This was where Thomas had died. Caleb knew the story. Everyone did. The boy had been working alone, training a green horse. Something had spooked the animal. In the chaos, a lantern had overturned. By the time they'd gotten Thomas out, the smoke had already done its damage. He'd lasted 3 days before his lungs gave out. Margaret had been holding his hand when he died. Looking at the burned-out shell of the building, Caleb felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't just grief. This was a wound that had never been allowed to heal, a festering reminder that Margaret faced every single day. No wonder she'd withdrawn. No wonder she'd turned to stone. He made his way back to the house as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. Mrs. Chen had laid out a cold supper in the dining room, sliced ham, fresh bread, pickled vegetables, a pitcher of buttermilk. 2 places set at opposite ends of the long table. Caleb waited and waited. Finally, as the light faded and the food grew cold, he began to eat alone. He was finishing his second piece of bread when Margaret appeared in the doorway. She'd changed from her black wedding dress into a simpler dark gray gown, her hair still pinned severely back. "You didn't need to wait," she said. "Seemed polite," Caleb replied. She moved to her place at the far end of the table, sat down with perfect posture, and began eating with precise mechanical movements. For several minutes, the only sound was the clink of silverware against porcelain. "Mrs. Chen will show you the routine tomorrow," Margaret said finally, not looking up from her plate. "Breakfast at 6. I take my lunch in my sitting room. Supper is at 7, whether you're here or not." "All right. You're free to use the library, the horses, if you ride. There's a small office off the kitchen where the ranch accounts are kept. You should familiarize yourself with them." "Why?" That made her pause. She set down her fork and regarded him with those cool gray eyes. "Because legally, they're your responsibility now. Half of everything I own became yours the moment we married. I don't want— What you want is irrelevant," she said calmly. "This is the arrangement. You have a role to play." "And what role is that?" Caleb heard the edge in his own voice, couldn't quite suppress it. "What exactly am I supposed to be to you?" For the first time, something flickered across her face. Pain, maybe. Or anger. It was gone before he could name it. "You're supposed to be a husband," she said softly. "In name. In public. So the vultures stop circling. so the bank stops questioning my competence. So I can live the remainder of my life without being treated like a helpless widow who needs a man to manage her affairs. She stood abruptly. Beyond that, I expect nothing from you, and I offer nothing in return. She left the room without another word. Caleb sat alone in the gathering darkness, staring at the cold food on his plate, and wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. The days that followed settled into a suffocating routine. Caleb woke early, helped with whatever work needed doing around the property, studied the ranch accounts until his eyes crossed, and avoided Margaret as much as humanly possible. It wasn't difficult. She kept to her sitting room most of the time, emerging only for meals, which she took in silence, and her occasional walks around the property, always alone, always in the evening when the light was failing. Mrs. Chen was his only real company, and even she maintained a professional distance. But she was kind in her way. She made sure he was fed. She answered his questions about the property, about Margaret's preferences, about how to navigate this strange new world he'd stumbled into. "Give her time," Mrs. Chen said one afternoon, echoing his mother's words. "She's been hurt, badly, more than you know." "I'm not trying to hurt her," Caleb said. "I'm just here." "That's the problem, maybe," Mrs. Chen replied cryptically. "You're here, but you're not really here. And she's here, but she's somewhere else entirely." Two ghosts rattling around in the same house. On the 5th day of his marriage, Caleb received a visitor. He was in the barn, attempting to fix a broken hinge on one of the stall doors, when he heard the sound of hooves. A moment later, Samuel Brennan appeared in the doorway, one of the men who'd been at the wedding, smirking in the third pew. "Turner," Brennan said, not bothering to dismount. "Or should I say Mr. Hale now?" Caleb straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. "What do you want, Samuel?" "Just paying a friendly visit, seeing how you're settling into your new position." The word dripped with contempt. "I'm fine. You can go." "Must be quite a change," Brennan continued, ignoring him. "Going from dirt farmer to landed gentleman overnight. Though I suppose you're earning it in your way. Can't be easy playing nursemaid to a woman old enough to be your mother." Caleb's hands clenched into fists. "Get out." "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. You sold yourself, Turner. Plain and simple. No different than the girls working at Rose's saloon, except they have more dignity about it." The words hit like a physical blow. Caleb took a step forward, rage boiling in his chest. But before he could reach Brennan, a voice cut across the barn. "Mr. Brennan?" Margaret stood in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun. She was wearing riding clothes, the first time Caleb had seen her in anything other than morning dress. She looked younger, somehow. Stronger. Brennan's smirk faltered. "Mrs. Hale, I was just leaving," Margaret finished. "And if I see you on my property again without invitation, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. Do I make myself clear?" Brennan's face flushed red. For a moment, Caleb thought he might argue. Then he jerked his horse's head around and spurred away without another word. Margaret watched him go, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to Caleb. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No." "Good." She started to leave, then paused. "You don't have to defend my honor, Mr. Turner. I'm quite capable of managing my own affairs." "I wasn't defending your honor," Caleb said quietly. "I was defending mine." She looked at him then, really looked at him, for the second time since their wedding. Something shifted in her eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or recognition. "I see," she said softly. Then, even softer, "Thank you for that." She walked away, leaving Caleb standing in the dusty barn, his heart pounding, wondering what the hell had just happened. That night, for the first time, Margaret didn't retreat to her sitting room after supper. Instead, she moved to the parlor and sat in the chair nearest the window, staring out at the darkening hills. Caleb hovered uncertainly in the doorway. "You can sit," she said without looking at him. "This is your home now, too." He crossed the room carefully, as if approaching a wild animal, and settled into the chair opposite hers. The silence stretched between them, not comfortable exactly, but less hostile than before. "I saw you looking at the old stable," Margaret said suddenly. Caleb's breath caught. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "It's all right. It's hardly a secret." She was still staring out the window, her profile carved in shadow and lamplight. That's where he died. My son, Thomas. I know. Everyone knows. Of course they do. Her voice was bitter. This town trades in tragedies like currency. She was quiet for the moment. Then, he was everything to me. The only good thing that came from my first marriage. Edmund was difficult, but Thomas made it bearable. And when Edmund died, Thomas was all I had left. All I wanted. Caleb didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. He was training a horse, Margaret continued, as if she couldn't stop now that she'd started. A beautiful bay mare, high-spirited but smart. He had such a gift with horses. With all animals, really. He could gentle the wildest creature with just his voice, his hands. Her own hands trembled in her lap. Something spooked her. A snake, maybe, or a sudden noise. She reared, caught her hoof in the rope, panicked. In the chaos, she knocked over the lantern. Thomas tried to get her out first. Of course he did. He always put others before himself. She paused, swallowing hard. By the time he realized the danger, the smoke was too thick. He couldn't find the door. I was in the house. I heard the horse screaming. I ran. But I couldn't get to him fast enough. The heat, the smoke. When we finally pulled him out, his lungs were ruined. He held on for 3 days. 3 days of drowning in his own body, and all I could do was watch. A single tear tracked down her cheek. She wiped it away impatiently, as if angry at herself for showing weakness. They wanted to tear down the stable, burn what was left, remove the reminder. I wouldn't let them. I needed to see it, to remember, to punish myself. Why would you punish yourself? Caleb asked gently. It was an accident. Was it? Margaret's voice was sharp. I was the one who asked him to train that horse. I was the one who wanted to expand our breeding program. If I hadn't pushed him, if I'd just been content with what we had, he'd still be alive. You can't know that. Can't I? She finally turned to look at him, and her eyes were devastating in their pain. I know that he's dead. I know that I'm alone. I know that no amount of money or land or purchased companionship will ever change that. The words stung, but Caleb pushed past the hurt. Is that what you think? That you're alone? Aren't I? You have me, Caleb said. The words surprised him even as he spoke them. Maybe not the way you wanted. Maybe not the way either of us wanted. But you're not alone, Mrs. Hale. Not anymore. Margaret stared at him for a long moment. Then she rose abruptly, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. You should go to bed, she said, her voice thick. It's late. She fled the room before he could respond. Caleb sat alone in the darkening parlor, listening to her footsteps on the stairs, the distant closing of her bedroom door. He felt like he'd just glimpsed something raw and wounded and desperately hidden, the truth beneath Margaret's armor. She wasn't cold. She was terrified. Terrified of feeling. Terrified of losing. Terrified of letting anyone close enough to hurt her again. And Caleb, for all his youth and inexperience, understood something in that moment. This marriage wasn't about saving his mother's land or preserving Margaret's dignity. Not really. This was about two people drowning in their own separate sorrows, trapped in the same house, breathing the same air, and too afraid to reach out across the distance between them. But maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to be. The next morning, Caleb woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since before his father died. He dressed quickly, skipped breakfast, and headed straight for the old stable. Mrs. Chen found him there 2 hours later, stripped to his undershirt, hauling charred timbers into a pile. What in heaven's name are you doing? She demanded. Cleaning up, Caleb said simply. Mrs. Hale won't like this. I know. She might fire you, send you away. I know. Mrs. Chen studied him for a long moment. Then slowly, she smiled. You'll need help. I'll send Joseph and Martin, and you'd better work fast. She takes her walk at 5 o'clock. For the next 3 days, Caleb worked like a man possessed. Joseph and Martin, the ranch hands who lived in the small house beyond the barn, helped him clear away the debris. They didn't ask questions. They just worked, steady and silent, until the ruined stable was nothing but an empty foundation and a pile of burned wood. On the 4th day, Caleb began to build. He used new timber from the lumber in the barn. He worked from dawn until dark, his hands blistering, his back aching, his muscles screaming. He'd helped his father build barns and fences his whole life. He knew what he was doing. But this was different. This wasn't just construction. This was an offering, a statement, a promise. On the seventh day Margaret found him, he was on the roof, hammering down shingles when her voice cut through the sound of his work. "What have you done?" He looked down. She stood in the clearing, staring at the new stable, still unfinished but unmistakably whole. Her face was white, her hands shook. Caleb climbed down carefully. When he reached the ground, she was still staring, frozen. "Mrs. Hale, I told you," she whispered. "I told you I needed to remember." "You can remember without torturing yourself," Caleb said quietly. "You can remember him without living in the place where he died." "You had no right." "You're right, I didn't, but I did it anyway." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were blazing with something he couldn't name. Fury, grief, fear. Maybe all of it at once. "Why?" she demanded. "Because you deserve better than a graveyard. Because Thomas deserves better than to be remembered only by the way he died. Because," he took a breath, "because I can't stand to watch you destroy yourself one day at a time." "You don't know me," Margaret said, but her voice cracked. "You don't know anything about me." "Then tell me," Caleb said. He took a step toward her, close enough to see the tears she was fighting. "Tell me about him. Not about how he died. About how he lived, what he loved, what made him laugh. Tell me about your son, Margaret. Please." She broke. The sound that came from her throat was raw and terrible, a sob that seemed dragged up from the deepest part of her soul. She staggered, and Caleb caught her before she could fall, his arms closing around her as she collapsed against him. She wept into his chest, her whole body shaking, 14 months of grief pouring out in great, wrenching sobs. Caleb held her, one hand in her hair, the other pressed against her back, and let her break apart in the safety of his arms. "He loved mourning," she gasped between sobs. "He'd wake before dawn just to watch the sunrise. He said, every day was a gift, and he wanted to see it being unwrapped." "That's beautiful," Caleb murmured. "He had terrible taste in jokes. The worse they were, the harder he'd laugh. And his laugh, oh, his laugh could light up the whole house. I wish I could have heard it." He wanted to be a veterinarian. He loved healing things, broken birds, injured rabbits, anything that hurt, he wanted to fix. "He sounds like he was extraordinary." "He was." Margaret pulled back slightly, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen and more alive than Caleb had ever seen them. "He was the best of me, and now he's gone, and I don't know how to be anything without him." "You start by living," Caleb said gently. He reached up and wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. "You start by letting yourself remember the joy, not just the pain. You start by finishing this stable and filling it with life again, the way Thomas would have wanted." Margaret's breath hitched. She stared up at him, and for a moment Caleb thought she might pull away, retreat back into her fortress of grief. Instead, she whispered, "Help me." "Always," Caleb promised. And in that moment, standing in the shadow of what they were building together, something fundamental shifted between them. The distance remained. The hurt remained. But for the first time since their hollow wedding, there was something else too. Hope. They worked together in the days that followed, side by side in a silence that felt less like avoidance and more like understanding. Margaret appeared each morning at dawn, her morning dresses traded for practical work clothes. Simple cotton blouses and dark skirts she tucked up to keep from dragging in the dirt. She didn't ask permission. She simply picked up a hammer or a saw and began working alongside Caleb, her movements precise and determined. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Color returned to her cheeks from the sun and exertion. Her hands, though blistered like his, moved with purpose instead of trembling in her lap. And sometimes, when Caleb made a mistake or said something foolish, he caught the ghost of a smile flickering across her face before she turned away. They didn't speak much, not about anything that mattered, but the work itself became a kind of conversation, a question asked with the angle of a beam, answered with the placement of a nail. They were building more than a stable. They were building a language neither of them had known they needed. On the 10th day, Joseph approached Caleb as he was measuring boards for the stable doors. The older ranch hand shifted his weight uncomfortably, his hat in his hands. "Mr. Turner, I need to tell you something." Caleb set down his measuring tape. What is it? Folks in town are talking. More than usual. Joseph's weathered face creased with concern. They're saying you're taking advantage, that you're working Mrs. Hale like a common laborer, that it ain't proper for a lady of her standing to be out here sweating like a field hand. What I do with my wife on my own property is nobody's business. Margaret's voice cut in sharply. She emerged from inside the stable, carrying an armload of straw for bedding. Her face was flushed, her hair escaping its pins, and she looked more alive than Caleb had ever seen her. Ma'am, I'm just telling you what's being said, Joseph replied carefully. Mrs. Pritchard came by yesterday while you were in town. She seemed mighty concerned about your situation. My situation, Margaret repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. She dumped the straw in the corner stall and turned to face Joseph fully. You mean my marriage to a man half my age? Or perhaps she's concerned that I've finally found something worth getting out of bed for in the morning. Joseph looked pained. She means well. She means to gossip, Margaret said flatly. And I'll thank you to tell her and anyone else who comes sniffing around that I'm quite capable of deciding how to spend my own time. Now, did Martin finish mending the fence in the south pasture? Yes, ma'am, this morning. Good. That'll be all, Joseph. The ranch hand left, still looking troubled. Margaret watched him go, her jaw set in a hard line. When she turned back to Caleb, some of the fire had gone out of her eyes, replaced by something more fragile. They think I've lost my mind, she said quietly. First for marrying you, now for working beside you like this. Have you? Caleb asked. She considered the question seriously. Perhaps, or perhaps I've finally found it again. She looked around the stable, at the clean new wood, the straight walls, the light streaming through the finished windows. This is the first thing I've built in 18 months. Everything else has been about preservation, holding on, keeping what I had from slipping away. But this is creation. Thomas would have liked it, Caleb said. Margaret's expression softened. Yes, he would have. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. He would have liked you too, I think. You have his hands. Caleb looked down at his own calloused, work-roughened hands. What do you mean? Builder's hands, healer's hands. She reached out, hesitated, then gently took his right hand in both of hers, turning it over to examine the fresh blisters and old scars. Hands that create instead of destroy. Hands that fix broken things. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I used to think nothing broken could ever be made whole again. That once something shattered, it stayed shattered forever. And now? She released his hand slowly, as if reluctant to break the contact. Now I'm not so certain. That evening, for the first time since their wedding, Margaret didn't retreat to her sitting room after supper. Instead, she led Caleb to the library, a room he'd barely entered, intimidated by the rows upon rows of leather-bound books that spoke of an education he'd never had. Can you read? She asked, running her fingers along the spines. Yes, my mother taught me. Good. She pulled down a slim volume with a worn cover. Then you should read this. It was Thomas's favorite. He must have read it a dozen times. Caleb took the book carefully. The title was embossed in faded gold, Black Beauty. A story about a horse? A story about kindness, Margaret corrected. About seeing the world through different eyes. About the cruelty people inflict without thinking, and the grace that's possible when we choose otherwise. She settled into one of the leather chairs, tucking her feet beneath her in a gesture that seemed almost girlish. Read it aloud, please. So Caleb read. His voice was rough at first, stumbling over unfamiliar words, but Margaret didn't correct him. She simply listened, her eyes closed, her face peaceful in the lamplight. He read for over an hour, until his throat grew dry and the words began to blur on the page. When he finally stopped, Margaret's eyes remained closed. He thought she might have fallen asleep, but then she spoke. He used to read to me, she said softly. When Edmund was alive and my headaches were bad, Thomas would sit by my bed and read until I felt better. He had the most beautiful voice, gentle but strong, like yours. Caleb felt something catch in his chest. Margaret, don't. She opened her eyes, and they were bright with unshed tears. Don't apologize for reminding me. Don't treat my grief like something shameful that needs to be hidden away. You've given me something precious, Caleb. You've given me permission to remember him with joy instead of only pain. That's a gift I didn't know I needed." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant song of crickets through the open window. It was the closest thing to peace Caleb had felt since his father died. The stable was finished on a bright Saturday morning in early May. Caleb nailed the last board into place and stepped back to admire their work. The building stood strong and clean, its new wood gleaming golden in the sunlight. It looked nothing like the charred ruin it had replaced, and yet, somehow, it honored what had been lost. Margaret stood beside him, her hand shading her eyes against the glare. "We should christen it," she said. "How?" "With life, the way it was meant to be used." She turned to him, and there was something almost mischievous in her expression. "Come with me to town. We're going to buy horses." The ride into town was Caleb's first real outing since the wedding. He rode beside Margaret in her carriage, acutely aware of every eye that followed their progress down the main street. The whispers started before they'd even stopped at the livery. "Look at them. Shameless. She's parading him around like a prize stallion." Margaret ignored it all with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime being talked about. She climbed down from the carriage without waiting for assistance and strode into the livery with her head high. Sam Cooper, the liveryman, straightened up quickly when he saw her. "Mrs. Hale, what can I do for you?" "I need 2 horses," Margaret said briskly. "Good stock. Strong, but gentle enough for training. What do you have?" Cooper scratched his jaw. "Well, I got a matched pair of chestnuts came in last week. 3-year-old geldings. Good bloodlines, but they're a bit green. Need someone with a firm hand." "Show me." The horses were beautiful, deep red coats that shone like copper pennies, white blazes on their foreheads, intelligent eyes. One of them nickered softly when Margaret approached, stretching his neck over the stall door to investigate her pockets for treats. "This one likes you," Caleb observed. "Thomas always said horses could sense character," Margaret murmured, stroking the animal's soft nose. "He'd approve of these 2. She turned to Cooper. "I'll take them both. Deliver them this afternoon." "Yes, ma'am. That'll be—" "Put it on my account." As they left the livery, Caleb noticed Mrs. Pritchard and Mrs. Morrison standing outside the general store, their heads bent together in animated conversation. When Margaret moved across the street toward them, Caleb touched her elbow gently. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "Yes," Margaret replied, "I do." She approached the 2 women with the bearing of a queen addressing her subjects. "Ladies, lovely morning, isn't it?" Mrs. Pritchard's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Margaret, dear, we were just talking about you." "I'm sure you were." "We're concerned," Mrs. Morrison added, her voice oozing false sympathy. "Working yourself to exhaustion, spending all your time in the barn like a common laborer. It's not healthy, Margaret. Not appropriate." "What's not appropriate," Margaret said coolly, "is discussing my private affairs in the middle of Main Street." "We're only thinking of your reputation," Mrs. Pritchard insisted. "People are talking. They're saying your new husband has you doing manual labor while he supervises. It reflects poorly on both of you." "Let me be clear," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a tone that could freeze fire. "My husband and I are rebuilding something that was destroyed, together, as equals. If the good people of this town have nothing better to do than speculate about how we choose to spend our time, then I suggest they examine their own lives more closely and leave mine alone." Mrs. Morrison gasped. "Well, I never—" "Yes, you have, repeatedly. You've made it your mission to comment on every aspect of my life since Edmund died. When I withdrew, you said I was mad with grief. When I married, you said I was desperate and foolish. Now that I'm finally living again, you say I'm improper. Tell me, Ruth, what would I have to do to earn your approval? Die quietly and leave my fortune to the church?" "Margaret," Mrs. Pritchard looked genuinely shocked. "The answer is nothing," Margaret continued, warming to her subject. "Because your approval has never been about me. It's about your own need to feel superior to someone. Well, I'm done performing for your entertainment. I have a life to live, a home to build, and a marriage that, frankly, makes me happier than I've been in years. If that offends your delicate sensibilities, then I suggest you look away." She turned on her heel and walked back to the carriage, leaving the 2 women sputtering in her wake. Caleb followed, fighting to keep the grin off his face. As they climbed into the carriage, Margaret's hands were shaking. "Did I go too far?" she asked quietly. "No," Caleb said. "You were perfect." She laughed then. A real laugh, bright and surprised and utterly genuine. It was the first time Caleb had heard her laugh, and the sound went through him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "I've wanted to say that for 5 years," she admitted, "ever since they started treating me like a fragile ornament instead of a person." "Why didn't you?" "Because I thought if I stayed quiet, stayed proper, stayed small, they'd leave me alone." She looked at him, her eyes bright. "But you've taught me something, Caleb. Silence doesn't protect you. It just makes you disappear." The horses arrived that afternoon, prancing nervously in the back of Cooper's wagon. Caleb and Joseph unloaded them carefully, leading them into the new stable one at a time. The chestnuts explored their surroundings with cautious curiosity, snuffling at the fresh straw, testing the strength of the stall doors with gentle pushes. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching. When both horses were settled, she stepped inside slowly, reverently, as if entering a sacred space. "The last time I was in a stable," she said softly, "I was pulling my son's body from the flames." Caleb moved to her side. "And now? Now I'm watching new life begin." She reached out and touched the nearest horse's neck, her fingers trembling slightly. "It doesn't erase what happened, but it proves that something can grow in the place where tragedy occurred, that we're not forever defined by our worst moments." Over the following weeks, training the horses became their shared ritual. Every morning, Caleb and Margaret worked with the chestnuts, teaching them to accept a saddle, to respond to commands, to trust human hands. The work was slow and patient, requiring a gentleness that surprised Caleb in himself and revealed depths in Margaret he'd never suspected. She had a gift with the animals. They responded to her voice, her touch, the calm certainty she projected. Watching her work, Caleb understood that this wasn't new. She'd done this before, probably alongside Thomas, back when the world had made sense and the future had stretched out bright and full of promise. "You're good at this," he told her one afternoon as she successfully convinced the more skittish of the two horses to accept a bit. "Thomas was better," she replied, but there was no bitterness in her voice, just gentle truth. He could read an animal's mind, or so it seemed. He'd know what they were thinking before they did. "Tell me more about him," Caleb said. "Not about the accident. About him." So she did. As they worked, Margaret began to share memories, small, precious details that brought Thomas to life in ways Caleb had never imagined. How he'd been afraid of thunderstorms as a child and would crawl into her bed seeking comfort. How he'd had a weakness for peppermint candy and would sneak pieces from the jar in the kitchen when he thought she wasn't looking. How he'd wanted to travel the world but couldn't bear to leave the ranch for more than a few days because he missed the land too much. "He was homesick even when he was home," Margaret said, smiling at the memory. He'd go on trips with Edmund to San Antonio or Houston, and within hours he'd be fidgeting, counting down the days until they could return. "He loved this place with his whole heart." "Like you do," Caleb observed. Margaret paused, considering. "Like I'm learning to again. I'd forgotten how to love anything after he died. I could only grieve, only mourn, only hold on to pain because it was the last thing connecting me to him." She looked at Caleb, her expression open and vulnerable in a way it had never been before. "But you've shown me that I can love this land and remember Thomas without making my whole life a monument to his death. That honoring his memory means living, not just existing." Their routine settled into something that felt almost normal. They rose early, worked the horses, took their meals together with actual conversation instead of strained silence. Margaret began joining Caleb for his evening readings, sometimes choosing the books herself, sometimes simply listening with her eyes closed and a peaceful expression on her face. But beneath the growing comfort, Caleb felt a tension building, something unspoken and electric that crackled in the air between them whenever they stood too close, whenever their hands brushed during their work, whenever he caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. She was beautiful. He'd known that intellectually from the first moment he saw her, but now he felt it in his bones. The way she moved, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way her face transformed when she smiled, shedding 20 years and revealing the girl she must have been before life and loss had hardened her. And he wanted her. Not just physically. though he couldn't deny the heat that pooled in his belly when she stood close enough for him to smell the lavender soap she used. But deeper than that, he wanted to know every part of her, every scar, every secret, every shadow she'd spent years hiding from the world. But the gap between them remained, 22 years, a lifetime of experiences he couldn't understand, and the unshakable awareness that she'd bought him, that their marriage had been a transaction, that anything he felt might simply be gratitude dressed up as something more noble. The tension finally broke on a sweltering afternoon in late May. They'd been working with the horses for hours, and both were exhausted and drenched in sweat. Margaret had stripped down to her chemise and petticoat, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, all pretense of propriety abandoned in the brutal heat. Caleb had discarded his shirt entirely, working bare-chested as the sun beat down mercilessly. When the more spirited of the two horses finally accepted his saddle without protest, Margaret let out a whoop of triumph and, without thinking, threw her arms around Caleb's neck. The embrace lasted only a second, a spontaneous expression of joy, nothing more. But when she pulled back, her hands remained on his shoulders, and suddenly the air between them felt charged with electricity. They were standing so close Caleb could see the flecks of green in her gray eyes, could feel the rapid rise and fall of her chest, could smell the salt-sweet scent of her skin in the heat. "Margaret," he said hoarsely. She stepped back abruptly as if burned. "I'm sorry, that was inappropriate." "Don't apologize." "I shouldn't have. We can't." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly self-conscious of her state of undress. "You're my husband in name only. I have no right to touch you that way. What if I want you to?" The words were out before Caleb could stop them. Margaret's eyes widened. "Don't say that." "Why not? It's true." "Because you're 24 years old," she said, her voice rising. "Because I'm old enough to be your mother. Because this marriage was a business arrangement, and you're confusing gratitude with something else entirely." "You think I'm grateful?" Caleb laughed bitterly. "I was humiliated, Margaret. I stood in that church and let myself be sold like livestock because I had no other choice. I hated you for it. I hated myself for it. I hated everything about this situation." She flinched as if he'd struck her. "Then why?" "Because that was before I knew you," he cut in. "Before I saw you cry for your son. Before I watched you build something beautiful from ashes. Before I realized that you're the strongest, bravest, most extraordinary person I've ever met." He took a step toward her. "I don't feel gratitude when I look at you, Margaret. I feel awe and desire. And something that scares the hell out of me because I've never felt it before." "Stop," she whispered, backing away. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that I want this marriage to be real. I'm saying that when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is seeing you. I'm saying that I lie awake at night 3 doors down from you and imagine what it would be like to have the right to come to you, to touch you, to—" "Caleb, please." Her back hit the stable wall. Tears streamed down her face. "You can't want me. Not really. Not when you could have any young woman in this county. Not when—" He closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me. Really, listen. You are not too old. You are not too damaged. You are not less worthy of love because you've lived longer or lost more than I have. You're magnificent, Margaret. And I want you. Not anyone else. You." For a long, breathless moment, they stared at each other. Then Margaret did something that shocked them both. She reached up, pulled his face down to hers, and kissed him. It was desperate and clumsy and fierce, her hands fisting in his hair, his arms wrapping around her waist to pull her closer. She tasted like salt and surprise and something wild and hungry that had been locked away too long. When they finally broke apart, both were shaking. "We can't," Margaret gasped against his mouth. "This is wrong. The age difference. What people will say." "I don't care what people say," Caleb said fiercely. "I've never cared. Let them talk. Let them judge. They're going to anyway." "But you deserve better than—" "You," he interrupted. "I deserve you. And maybe, if you can stop being terrified long enough to believe it, you deserve me too." She searched his face, looking for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that this was temporary insanity. What she found instead was absolute certainty. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "I know. If I let myself love you and lose you, you won't. You can't promise that. No, Caleb agreed. But I can promise that I'm here now, that I choose you now, that whatever time we have, I want to spend it as your husband, really your husband, not just in name. Margaret trembled in his arms. Then slowly she nodded. Show me, she whispered. So he did. He kissed her again, slower this time, reverent and thorough. He traced the lines of her face with his fingertips, learning the landscape of her body the way she'd taught him to gentle the horses, with patience and care and absolute attention. When he lifted her into his arms and carried her from the stable toward the house, she didn't protest. She simply buried her face against his neck and held on. Mrs. Chen took one look at them and wordlessly disappeared toward her own quarters. Caleb carried Margaret up the stairs, past the room that had been his, straight to hers, the room he'd never entered, the sanctuary she'd kept inviolate for 18 months. He set her down gently and waited. This had to be her choice, her invitation. She looked at him for a long moment, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Then she reached up and began unbuttoning her chemise with trembling fingers. Stay with me, she said softly. Not 3 doors down. Here, with me. Always, Caleb promised. And as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows and the sounds of the ranch drifted up from below, they finally, fully, became husband and wife. The change in their relationship was immediate and unmistakable. When they descended for supper that evening, Caleb's hand rested naturally at the small of Margaret's back, and she didn't pull away. Mrs. Chen took one look at them, at Margaret's loose hair, at Caleb's softened expression, at the way they moved in orbit around each other, and allowed herself the smallest of smiles before serving the meal without comment. They sat at adjacent places now instead of at opposite ends of the long table. Their knees touched beneath the cloth. Their hands found each other between courses. And when Margaret laughed at something Caleb said, a genuine, unguarded laugh that filled the dining room with warmth, Mrs. Chen had to turn away to hide her own pleased expression. But the outside world was less forgiving. The rumors reached them within 3 days. Joseph brought the news, hat in hand, his weathered face troubled. Mr. Turner, folks are saying things, ugly things. Caleb looked up from the bridle he was mending. What kind of things? That you've seduced Mrs. Hale. That you're taking advantage of a lonely widow who doesn't know better. That you're after her money and using her affections to secure your position. Joseph shifted uncomfortably. Samuel Brennan's been telling anyone who'll listen that you're nothing but a fortune hunter who married up and now thinks he's entitled to play Lord of the Manor. Let him talk, Caleb said evenly. It's not just him, Mrs. Pritchard's been organizing the church ladies. They're talking about paying a visit to Mrs. Hale, an intervention, they're calling it, to save her from making a fool of herself. This time, Caleb's hand stilled on the leather. When? Tomorrow afternoon, while you're in town picking up the lumber order. Caleb found Margaret in the library, curled in her favorite chair with a book. She looked up when he entered, her face brightening in a way that made his chest ache. The church ladies are planning an ambush tomorrow, he said without preamble. They want to convince you that I'm taking advantage of you. Margaret's expression hardened. Do they? I can stay. Cancel the trip to town. No. She set down her book and rose. I've spent too many years letting those women dictate how I should live, how I should grieve, how I should behave. If they want to come here and lecture me about my own marriage, then let them come. It's time we settled this once and for all. Margaret, she crossed to him and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. I'm not a fragile widow who needs protecting, Caleb. I'm a woman who's finally remembered how to fight for what she wants. And I want you. If they can't accept that, then they can take their sanctimonious concern and choke on it. Despite everything, Caleb laughed. You're terrifying when you're angry. Good, she said, rising on her toes to kiss him. Then perhaps they'll think twice before interfering in my affairs again. The next afternoon, Caleb left for town with Martin to collect the lumber they'd ordered for expanding the stable. He went reluctantly, looking back at the house 3 times before the carriage rounded the bend and took it from view. Margaret watched him go from the parlor window, then turned to Mrs. Chen. How many should I expect? 6 at least. Maybe 8. Mrs. Chen's mouth was set in a grim line. Mrs. Pritchard, Mrs. Morrison, Mrs. Yates, Mrs. Brennan, Samuel's mother, of course. Margaret smoothed her skirt. She'd dressed carefully that morning in one of her finer gowns, deep blue silk that brought out the color in her eyes. Not morning black, not widow's gray. Blue, the color of sky and possibility. Set out the good china, please. If they're coming to judge me, they'll do it properly. They arrived precisely at 2:00, a delegation of righteousness in their Sunday best, Mrs. Pritchard led the procession, flanked by Mrs. Morrison and 4 other women whose expressions ranged from pious concern to barely concealed schadenfreude. Margaret received them in the parlor with perfect courtesy, as if this were a social call and not an inquisition. "Ladies, how kind of you to visit. Please, sit." They arranged themselves on the furniture like birds of prey settling on a branch, all sharp eyes and sharper tongues. Mrs. Chen served tea in brittle silence before withdrawing. Mrs. Pritchard wasted no time on pleasantries. "Margaret, we've come out of genuine concern for your welfare." "How thoughtful." "We understand you've been unwell lately. The strain of your recent marriage, the impropriety of the situation, it would be enough to unsettle any woman of good breeding." Margaret sipped her tea calmly. "I assure you, I'm quite well." "Are you?" Mrs. Morrison leaned forward, her expression oozing false sympathy. "Because, from what we've observed, your behavior has become increasingly erratic. Working in the stables like a common laborer, parading around town with that boy on your arm. And now we hear that he's moved into your private chambers." "My husband has moved into my bedroom, yes," Margaret said evenly, "as husbands generally do." Scandalized gasps rippled through the group. Mrs. Yates actually clutched her handkerchief to her chest as if experiencing palpitations. "You can't be serious," Mrs. Pritchard said sharply. "Margaret, the boy is young enough to be your son. What you're describing is unseemly at best, exploitative at worst." "Exploitative?" Margaret set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Tell me, Eleanor, which of us do you believe is being exploited? The wealthy widow who married a penniless young man? Or the penniless young man who married a wealthy widow? Because, from where I sit, the power in this relationship has never been balanced in his favor." "That's exactly our point," Mrs. Morrison interjected. "You hold all the power. You bought him, Margaret. You purchased a husband the way one purchases livestock. And now you're using that power to satisfy unnatural desires that a woman of your age should have long since put aside." The words hung in the air like poison. Margaret felt rage building in her chest, hot and righteous, but she kept her voice perfectly level. "Unnatural desires. How fascinating. Tell me, Ruth, at what age precisely does a woman become too old to desire her husband? 40? 45? Should I have consulted a calendar before allowing myself to feel something other than grief for the first time in 18 months? "You're being deliberately obtuse," Mrs. Pritchard snapped. "We're trying to help you see reason. This boy, this Caleb Turner, he doesn't love you. He can't possibly. He married you for your money, and now he's taking advantage of your loneliness to secure his position. Can't you see that?" "What I see," Margaret said, her voice dropping to something cold and dangerous, "is a group of women who've spent so long judging others that they've forgotten how to live themselves. Tell me, Eleanor, when was the last time your husband looked at you the way Caleb looks at me? When was the last time Harold made you laugh, made you feel alive instead of merely existing?" Mrs. Pritchard's face flushed crimson. "How dare you? And you, Ruth, your marriage to William has been a cold arrangement for 20 years. Everyone knows it. He keeps a mistress in San Antonio, and you pretend not to notice. So please, spare me your lectures on appropriate marital relations." Mrs. Morrison stood abruptly, shaking with fury. "You've lost your mind." "No," Margaret said, rising to her full height. "I found it. For years, I let you and women like you dictate how I should behave. I stayed silent when you whispered about my marriage to Edmund. I endured your pity when Thomas died. I accepted your judgment when I withdrew from society. And when I finally decided to marry again, to try to build something from the ruins of my life, you condemned that too. Nothing I do will ever be right in your eyes because you need someone to feel superior to, someone to pity, someone to judge. Well, I'm done being your charity case." "Margaret, please." Mrs. Yates began weakly. Get out, Margaret said quietly. Now wait just a minute, Mrs. Pritchard started. Get out! Margaret's voice was steel wrapped in silk. Get out of my house. Get off my property. And if any of you ever presume to tell me how to live my life again, I will make it my personal mission to ruin you socially, financially, and in every other way I can devise. I own half this county. I control credit lines and supply chains and political favors that your husbands desperately need. Do not test me. The women fled, literally fled, gathering their skirts and their wounded dignity and practically running for their carriages. Margaret stood at the parlor window and watched them go, her hands trembling with adrenaline. Mrs. Chen appeared at her elbow. That was magnificent, ma'am. That was terrifying, Margaret corrected. I've just made enemies of the most influential women in the county. You've also just declared your independence from their tyranny. Mr. Turner will be proud. But when Caleb returned home that evening, he wasn't proud. He was furious. The moment he walked through the door, Margaret knew something was wrong. His face was tight, his jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with an anger she'd never seen before. What happened? She asked. Brennan happened. He was in town, drunk and running his mouth, saying things about you, about us, vile things that I won't repeat. Caleb, he called you a desperate old woman, so starved for attention that you'd bought yourself a young stallion to service you. The words came out like broken glass. He said I was nothing but a whore with a wedding ring, selling myself to the highest bidder. He said, his voice cracked, he said I was no better than the girls who worked the saloons, except they at least have the honesty to call it what it is. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. What did you do? I hit him. Hard. Split his lip and probably broke his nose. Martin had to pull me off before I killed him. Caleb paced the parlor like a caged animal. The sheriff saw the whole thing. He wants me to come in tomorrow to answer for it. There's talk of pressing charges for assault. I'll handle the sheriff, Margaret said immediately. I'll pay whatever fine. No. Caleb spun to face her. No. I won't be that man. I won't be the man who hides behind his wife's money and influence every time someone says something I don't like. I won't prove them right by letting you fight my battles. This isn't about proving them right or wrong, Margaret said, frustration creeping into her voice. This is about protecting you from consequences you don't deserve. I do deserve them, Caleb shouted. I threw the first punch. I let my temper control me. Those are the consequences of my own actions, not something for you to fix with your checkbook. They stared at each other across the parlor, the air crackling with tension. This was their first real fight, and both of them could feel the foundation of their new relationship trembling beneath them. So what do you want me to do? Margaret asked quietly. Stand by and watch while they tear you apart for defending my honor? Your honor doesn't need defending, Caleb said. Mine does, and I can't defend it by running to you every time things get difficult. Don't you see? That's exactly what they expect. That's exactly what they want. For me to prove that I'm nothing without you, that I'm just a kept man who can't stand on his own 2 feet. You're not a kept man, aren't I? The question was bitter. I live in your house. I work your land. I spend your money. I sleep in your bed. Everything I have, everything I am in this county exists because of you. How is that different from being kept? The words struck Margaret like physical blows. Is that truly how you see this? As me keeping you? Caleb's expression crumpled. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. No, that's not what I meant. I'm sorry. I'm just so damn tired of being seen as less than, as a transaction, as something you bought instead of someone you chose. Margaret held him tightly, feeling his heart racing against her chest. Then we make them see differently. How? She pulled back to look him in the eye. Tomorrow, we go to the sheriff together. We face whatever comes together, not with me protecting you or you protecting me, but as equals, as partners. You take responsibility for your actions, yes, but I stand beside you while you do it. I won't hide our relationship or apologize for it. I won't let them reduce us to their ugly narratives. We show them who we really are. And who are we? Caleb asked. We're 2 people who found each other in the wreckage of our separate griefs, Margaret said softly. Two people who chose to build something new instead of drowning in what we'd lost. Two people who are brave enough to love each other despite what anyone thinks. That's who we are. The next morning, they rode into town together in the carriage. The streets fell silent as they passed, every eye tracking their progress. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the scent of scandal like vultures to carrion. Sheriff Matthews was a fair man, weathered and practical, who'd known Margaret since she was a girl. He looked genuinely pained when they entered his office. "Mrs. Hale, Mr. Turner, I was hoping we could settle this quietly." "So was I," Caleb said. "I'm here to take responsibility for striking Samuel Brennan. Whatever the consequence is, I'll accept it." "He was defending me from slander," Margaret added. "Surely that carries some weight." "It would," Matthews said carefully, "if young Brennan hadn't gotten himself so worked up that he's demanding the maximum penalty. He's talking about pressing charges for assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. That's serious, Mrs. Hale. That could mean jail time." "For breaking a drunk's nose?" Margaret's voice was incredulous. "John, you can't be serious. I'm not the one pushing for it. But Brennan's got his mother involved now, and you know how she is. She's talking about making an example, about not letting violence go unpunished just because the perpetrator married well." Caleb felt Margaret tense beside him. "So this isn't about justice. It's about punishing me for standing up to the church ladies yesterday." Matthews had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I'm just trying to keep the peace, ma'am. This town's already buzzing with talk about you and Mr. Turner. Adding a criminal trial to the mix won't help matters." "Then what do you suggest?" Caleb asked. "I suggest," a new voice said from the doorway, "that Samuel Brennan withdraw his complaint before I make his life considerably more difficult." They all turned. Judge Harrison Caldwell stood in the doorway, a silver-haired man in his 60s with the bearing of someone used to being obeyed. He'd been a friend of Edmund Hale's, had presided over Thomas's estate settlement, and was one of the few people in town Margaret genuinely respected. "Judge Caldwell," Matthews said, straightening, "I didn't know you were in town. I arrived this morning on circuit business. Imagine my surprise when I heard that young Brennan was attempting to criminalize a perfectly justified response to public defamation." He stepped into the office fully, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. "Margaret, my dear, you're looking well." "Harrison," Margaret's relief was palpable. "I didn't expect to see you." "Clearly. Or you might have consulted me before the situation escalated." He turned to Matthews. "John, where is Mr. Brennan now?" "At his mother's house, nursing his wounds and his wounded pride." "Excellent. Have him brought here, immediately. And bring his mother too. I'd like to have a conversation about the legal definition of slander and the consequences of filing false charges." Matthews nodded and hurried out. When he was gone, Caldwell turned to Caleb and extended his hand. "You must be the young man who's caused such a stir." "Harrison Caldwell." "Caleb Turner, sir." They shook hands. "I appreciate your help, but I did hit him. That's not a false charge." "No, but the claim of grievous bodily harm is absurd, and the motivation for pressing charges is pure vindictiveness. I've known the Brennan family for 30 years. Samuel's a bully who's never faced real consequences for his actions. It's about time someone gave him a taste of what happens when you provoke the wrong person." Margaret touched Caldwell's arm. "Harrison, you don't have to involve yourself in this. Our problems aren't your responsibility." "No, but ensuring justice in this county is, and there's no justice in allowing petty tyrants like Alice Brennan to weaponize the legal system because she's angry that you refuse to be bullied by her friends." He settled into the chair behind Matthew's desk as if he owned it. "Besides, Edmund would have expected me to look after you, and from what I've observed, your young husband here has more spine than half the men in this county. I rather like him." 20 minutes later, Samuel Brennan arrived with his mother in tow. His nose was indeed broken, swollen, and purple, and his lip was split. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. Alice Brennan, on the other hand, came in swinging. "Judge Caldwell, thank heavens. Perhaps you can talk some sense into Sheriff Matthews. This young thug attacked my son in broad daylight, and he's trying to sweep it under the rug because of who the boy married." "Sit down, Alice," Caldwell said mildly. "I will not sit down. I said sit." The command in his voice was absolute. Alice sat. Caldwell turned his attention to Samuel. "Tell me, in your own words, exactly what happened yesterday." Samuel shifted uncomfortably. I was having a conversation with some fellows at the saloon. Turner here came in and attacked me for no reason. No reason? So you weren't discussing Mrs. Hale at all? Samuel's eyes flickered. I might have mentioned her. So what? It's a free country. Indeed it is. Free speech is a cherished right. However, slander and defamation are not protected speech. They're actionable offenses. Caldwell leaned forward. Now, I'm going to ask you again, and I suggest you think very carefully before you answer. What exactly did you say about Mrs. Hale? The silence stretched. Samuel's face flushed red, and he couldn't meet anyone's eyes. I thought as much, Caldwell said. Let me explain your situation, young man. If you proceed with charges against Mr. Turner, I will personally ensure that he countersues for the defamatory statements that provoked the altercation. Given that there were multiple witnesses to your comments, and given that Mrs. Hale is a woman of impeccable reputation in this community, you will lose, badly, and the judgment against you will be substantial enough to bankrupt you and possibly your family. You can't, Alice started. I can, and I will. Furthermore, I'll make sure that every saloon and establishment in this county knows that serving you alcohol results in legal liability, given your tendency to run your mouth when drunk. You'll be persona non grata before the week is out. He sat back, his expression pleasant. Or you can withdraw your complaint, apologize to Mr. and Mrs. Turner, and we can all move on with our lives. Which will it be? Samuel looked at his mother. Alice's face was mottled with rage, but even she could see the writing on the wall. Withdraw the complaint, she bit out. Louder, please, and address the Turners directly. Samuel stood, wincing at the movement. I withdraw my complaint, and I apologize for what I said. It was out of line. Good, Caldwell said. Now get out of my sight, both of you. They left quickly, Alice's furious muttering audible even after the door closed behind them. Matthews returned from wherever he'd been tactfully waiting and looked at Caldwell with respect. Nicely handled, Your Honor. It was necessary. Caldwell turned to Margaret and Caleb. However, I should warn you both, this won't be the end of it. You've made enemies of some very determined women, Margaret. They'll find other ways to cause trouble. Let them try, Margaret said firmly. Her hand found Caleb's and squeezed. We're not running, we're not hiding, we're not apologizing for our marriage or our happiness. If that makes us targets, then so be it. Caldwell smiled. Edmund always said you had more steel in your spine than most men. He was right. He stood and gathered his papers. Now, I have actual court business to attend to. But, Margaret dear, you and your husband should come to dinner next week. My wife would love to meet the man who's finally brought color back to your cheeks. After he left, Caleb and Margaret stood together in the sheriff's office, still holding hands, still standing side by side. That could have gone much worse, Caleb said quietly. Yes, but it shouldn't have happened at all. Margaret turned to face him fully. I'm sorry, this is my fault. If I hadn't confronted the church ladies, if I'd been more diplomatic, then we'd still be hiding, still pretending, still letting them control our lives. Caleb lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. You were right yesterday. We needed to draw a line. We needed to make it clear that we won't be bullied or shamed or reduced to their ugly assumptions, even if it makes things harder. They walked out of the sheriff's office together, heads high, and faced the crowd that had gathered. The whispers started immediately, but Margaret didn't care. Let them whisper, let them judge. She had chosen her path, and she'd walk it with her head high and her husband at her side. That evening, as they sat together in the library, Caleb reading aloud while Margaret listened with her head resting against his shoulder, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not just happiness, not just peace, but the bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly who she belonged with, building exactly the life she was meant to live. Whatever storms came next, they would weather them together, as equals, as partners, as two people who'd chosen each other freely, completely, and without apology. And that, Margaret thought, as Caleb's voice washed over her and the lamplight painted everything in shades of gold, was worth any price the world demanded they pay. The peace lasted exactly 9 days. It began with small things, supplies that suddenly became unavailable at the general store, merchants who claimed to be out of stock on items Margaret had ordered weeks ago, workers who canceled commitments to help with the fall harvest preparations. Then came the more deliberate slights. Invitations that stopped arriving, social calls that dried up completely. Even the minister stopped including Margaret's name when he read the prayer list on Sundays, as if she'd ceased to exist in the eyes of polite society. Margaret bore it all with stoic grace, but Caleb could see the toll it was taking. She grew quieter during meals, more withdrawn. The light that had returned to her eyes began to dim, and he recognized the warning signs of her retreating back into herself. It came to a head on a brutally hot afternoon in early June. Margaret had gone to town alone to settle some business at the bank, insisting that Caleb stay behind to work with the horses. When she returned 3 hours later, her face was ashen, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the reins. Caleb was in the barn when he heard the carriage. One look at her face sent him running. What happened? He reached up to help her down, but she flinched away from his touch. Not here, she said, her voice barely audible. Inside. She walked to the house like someone navigating through deep water, each step requiring immense effort. Mrs. Chen took one look at her and immediately began preparing tea, her face grave with concern. In the parlor, Margaret collapsed into a chair and sat staring at nothing. Caleb knelt beside her, fear coiling in his gut. Margaret, talk to me. What happened in town? She was silent for so long he thought she might not answer. Then in a voice stripped of all emotion, she said, The bank has called in my loans. Caleb felt the world tilt. What? Why? Because apparently, several of my creditors have expressed concern about my ability to manage my affairs. They cited my recent marriage, my erratic behavior, my declining social standing. They've decided I represent an unacceptable risk. Her laugh was bitter and broken. 20 years of impeccable credit, 20 years of building this ranch, expanding my holdings, never missing a single payment. And it all means nothing because I married you. The words hit Caleb like a sledgehammer. How much do you owe? $15,000, due in 60 days. Can you pay it? Not without liquidating everything. The cattle, the land leases, possibly even selling off portions of the ranch itself. Everything Edmund and I built. Everything I've preserved for... She stopped, swallowing hard. Everything I've tried to hold on to would be gone. Caleb stood abruptly, rage flooding through him. This is Alice Brennan's doing. She's orchestrated this whole thing as revenge. It doesn't matter whose doing it is. The result is the same. Margaret finally looked at him, and the defeat in her eyes was devastating. Maybe they're right. Maybe I've lost my ability to manage my affairs. Maybe marrying you was the foolish, desperate act of a woman who'd lost her grip on reality. Don't, Caleb said sharply. Don't you dare let them put those words in your mouth. But what if they're right? Her voice cracked. What if I've destroyed everything in pursuit of something that was never meant to be? You're 24 years old, Caleb. You should be courting girls your own age, building a life with someone who can give you children, give you a future. Instead, you're shackled to a woman old enough to be your mother, watching her world crumble around her. Stop it. Caleb grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. Listen to me. You haven't destroyed anything. They're destroying it, out of spite and jealousy and small-minded cruelty, but we're not going to let them win. How do we fight this? Even Judge Caldwell can't force the bank to extend credit they've chosen to withdraw. No, Caleb said slowly, an idea forming in his mind. But we can give them a reason to reconsider. We can show them that you're not a foolish widow making poor decisions. We can prove that this ranch is thriving, that our marriage is a partnership of equals, and that calling in your loans would be the worst business decision they could make. Margaret shook her head. How? We have 60 days. That's not enough time to... It is if we move fast. Caleb's mind was racing now, pieces falling into place. You own 4,000 acres. How much of it is actually being used? About half. The rest is just sitting idle. Then we put it to work. We bring in cattle, not on lease, but owned outright. We show growth, expansion, profit potential. We make this ranch so valuable that calling in your loans would mean passing up the best investment in the county. That requires capital we don't have, Margaret pointed out. No, it requires credit, and I know where to get it. Caleb stood, pulling her up with him. My mother's land, the land I thought I'd lost. It's still in our name, isn't it? You bought the debt, but you never actually foreclosed. Margaret blinked, understanding dawning. No, I didn't. I told your mother she could stay there as long as she lived. The deed is still in the Turner name. Then we use it as collateral. We go to a bank in San Antonio, somewhere outside Alice Brennan's sphere of influence. We get a loan against that land to buy cattle. We show the local bank that we're expanding, not contracting. That we're a growing concern, not a failing enterprise. Caleb, that's your inheritance. Your family's legacy. If this fails, you lose everything. I've already lost everything once, he said quietly, when my father died and the debts came due. This time, I'm choosing to risk it. For us, for our future, for the life we're building together. He cupped her face in his hands. I believe in you, Margaret. I believe in us. And I'm willing to bet everything I have on that belief. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I don't deserve you. Yes, you do. And I deserve you. Now stop arguing and help me figure out the details. They spent the next 2 hours planning. Margaret retrieved all her financial records, spreading them across the dining room table. Caleb pored over the numbers. His basic education in arithmetic stretched to its limits, but his determination unwavering. We need at least 8,000 to make this work, Margaret calculated. 6,000 for cattle, 2,000 for operating expenses, and feed through the winter. The Turner land is worth at least 10, Caleb said. More if we find the right appraiser. We'll have enough. And if the bank in San Antonio won't lend to us, then we try Austin or Houston. We keep trying until someone says yes. He looked at her across the table strewn with papers and possibilities. We don't give up. We don't surrender. We fight. Margaret nodded slowly, and Caleb watched as something shifted in her expression. The defeat faded, replaced by the steel he'd seen when she confronted the church ladies, when she stood up to Samuel Brennan, when she chose to love him despite the cost. All right, she said. We fight. They left for San Antonio at dawn the next day. The journey took 12 hours by train, the Texas landscape rolling past in waves of golden grass and endless sky. They sat close together in the passenger car, speaking little but drawing strength from each other's presence. San Antonio was a revelation to Caleb. He'd never been to a real city before. The noise, the crowds, the buildings stacked 3 and 4 stories high. Margaret navigated it all with practiced ease, leading him to a hotel near the river where she'd stayed on business trips with Edmund years ago. The bank manager they met with the following morning was a sharp-eyed man named Peterson who listened to their proposal with professional skepticism. Let me understand this correctly, he said, steepling his fingers. You want to borrow $8,000 against property in Kendall County to purchase cattle for a ranch that currently has loans being called in by your local bank, and you expect me to see this as a sound investment? The loans are being called in for personal reasons, not financial ones, Margaret said calmly. My credit history is impeccable. I've never missed a payment, never defaulted on an obligation. The only thing that's changed is my marital status, and the local bank is allowing social pressure to influence what should be a purely business decision. Peterson turned to Caleb. And you're willing to put up your family's land as collateral? Yes, sir. Why? If your wife's ranch fails, you lose everything. If my wife's ranch fails, I've already lost everything that matters, Caleb said simply. The land is just dirt and grass. My marriage, my partnership with Margaret, that's my real inheritance. That's what I'm fighting for. Peterson studied them both for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. My wife is 12 years older than me, he said. When we married, her family disowned her. My family called me a fortune hunter. The bank where I worked at the time politely suggested I resign to avoid embarrassing them. So I came here, to a city where no one knew us, and I built my career from nothing. He leaned back in his chair. I understand what you're up against, Mr. and Mrs. Turner, and I admire your courage. Does that mean you'll help us? Margaret asked. It means I'll consider it. I'll need to send someone to appraise the Turner property. I'll need complete financial records for the Hale Ranch. And I'll need a detailed business plan showing exactly how you intend to use this capital and how you'll generate the revenue to repay the loan. He pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing. Can you provide all that within 2 weeks? Yes, they said in unison. Then we have the basis for a deal. They left the bank in a state of cautious euphoria. Margaret practically floated down the street, Her hand tightened Caleb's, her face radiant with relief and renewed hope. "We did it," she breathed. "We actually have a chance." "We have more than a chance," Caleb said. "We have a plan. We have a future. We have each other." That night, in their hotel room overlooking the river, they made love with a desperation born of relief and rekindled hope. Afterward, lying tangled together in the cool sheets, Margaret traced idle patterns on Caleb's chest. "Tell me something," she said quietly. "That day in the church, when you said, 'I do,' did you hate me?" Caleb considered lying, then decided she deserved the truth. "Yes. In that moment, I hated you. I hated the situation. I hated feeling powerless. I hated that my father's death had reduced me to something to be bought and sold." She flinched, but he caught her hand and held it against his heart. "But that was before I knew you," he continued. "Before I understood that you were just as trapped as I was. Before I realized that sometimes the things we think will destroy us are actually the things that save us." He turned to look at her, memorizing her face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I don't hate you now. I love you. Desperately. Completely. In a way that terrifies me because I've never felt anything like it before." "I love you too," Margaret whispered. "I fought it for so long, told myself it was impossible, inappropriate, wrong. But loving you is the first thing I've done in 18 months that feels right, that feels real." "Then we hold on to that. Whatever comes next, we hold on to this." They returned to the ranch 3 days later with renewed purpose. While they waited for the appraiser from San Antonio, they threw themselves into preparing for the cattle purchase. Caleb and the ranch hands spent long days repairing fences, clearing brush from the unused pastures, and ensuring the water sources were adequate for a larger herd. Margaret divided her time between the ranch work and preparing the detailed financial records Peterson had requested. Every night, she and Caleb sat together at the dining room table, going over numbers until the lamplight made their eyes ache. The appraiser arrived on a sweltering afternoon 2 weeks after their San Antonio trip. He was a thorough man who spent an entire day walking every inch of the Turner property, testing the soil, examining the water rights, and consulting survey maps. When he finally rendered his verdict, Caleb held his breath. $10,000, the appraiser said. Possibly 12 if the market conditions are favorable. It's prime bottomland with excellent water access. Any farmer or rancher in the county would be fortunate to own it. The loan was approved 3 days later, $8,000, to be repaid over 5 years at 6% interest. The news arrived by telegram, and when Margaret read it aloud, her voice broke on the last word. They stood together in the ranch office, holding each other as the enormity of what they'd accomplished washed over them. They'd fought back. They'd found a way forward. They'd refused to be broken by the cruelty and small-mindedness of people who wanted to see them fail. "Now comes the hard part," Margaret said, pulling back to look at him. "We have to make this work. We have to prove them all wrong." "We will," Caleb promised. The cattle purchase happened in late June. Caleb and Margaret traveled to a ranch in the hill country and spent 3 days selecting stock, 200 head of mixed breeds, healthy animals with good bloodlines that would form the foundation of their new herd. The seller, an older rancher named Dutch Carlson, took an immediate liking to them. "You two remind me of my wife and me when we were starting out," he said as they finalized the sale. "Young and determined and too stubborn to know when you're beat. That's what it takes to make it in this business. That and a lot of luck." "We'll take whatever luck you can spare," Margaret said with a smile. The drive back to the ranch took 6 days. Caleb rode alongside the hired drovers, learning the rhythms of moving cattle across rough country, while Margaret traveled ahead in the carriage to ensure everything was ready for the herd's arrival. By the time they reached home, Caleb was sunburned, saddle sore, and happier than he'd been in months. Watching the cattle stream onto their land, hearing the lowing of 200 animals settling into their new home, seeing the look of pride and satisfaction on Margaret's face, it all felt like vindication. They'd done this, together, against all odds and opposition, but their triumph didn't go unnoticed in town. Word spread quickly about the cattle purchase, and with it came new waves of gossip. Some said Margaret had mortgaged her soul to finance Caleb's wild schemes. Others claimed she was being manipulated by a young fortune hunter who was systematically stripping her assets. A few suggested that the whole thing was bound to fail and would leave Margaret destitute before the year was out. The cruelest blow came from an unexpected source. Caleb was in town picking up supplies when he encountered his mother outside the post office. He hadn't seen her in weeks. She'd made herself scarce after the wedding, unable or unwilling to face the gossip that surrounded her son's marriage. "Mama," he said, his heart lifting, "it's good to see you." But Sarah Turner didn't smile. She looked at him with eyes full of disappointment and shame. "What you've done is wrong, Caleb," she said quietly. "Putting up our land as collateral for her debts. That land was your father's legacy, his life's work. And you've gambled it away for a woman who'll be dead and buried long before you reach middle age." The words were like ice water in his veins. "Mama, it's not like that, isn't it? You've tied yourself to a woman who's using you, whether you can see it or not. And when this all falls apart, and it will, Caleb, mark my words, you'll have nothing. No land, no inheritance, no future. All because you were too proud or too foolish to see what everyone else can see plain as day." "And what's that?" Caleb asked, his voice tight with pain. "That she's bought herself a young man to ease her loneliness, and you've sold yourself for comfort and security. It's not love, Caleb. It's not a real marriage. It's just two people using each other and calling it something noble to make themselves feel better." She walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing alone on the wooden sidewalk with her words echoing in his head. That night, Caleb couldn't bring himself to tell Margaret what had happened. He went through the motions: dinner, evening chores, the quiet hour they usually spent reading together. But Margaret knew him too well by now to be fooled. "What's wrong?" she asked as they prepared for bed. "Nothing." "Caleb," she caught his hand, forcing him to look at her. "We promised each other honesty. What happened today?" So he told her. Every word his mother had said, every accusation, every doubt. When he finished, Margaret was pale but composed. "She's not entirely wrong," Margaret said quietly. "What?" "Not about us using each other. That's absurd. But about the risk. About what you stand to lose." She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "I am older than you, Caleb. Significantly older. Barring accident or illness, I will almost certainly die before you. You'll spend decades as a widower, possibly alone, tied to memories of a woman most people thought you were wrong to marry in the first place." "I know all that," Caleb said. "I've always known it. But have you really thought about it? Really considered what it means?" Her voice was thick with unshed tears. "I can't give you children, Caleb. My body is too old for that. I can't give you the long partnership that young couples have, decades and decades of building a life together. I can give you maybe 20 years if we're very lucky, maybe less. Is that enough? Is that fair to ask of you?" Caleb crossed to her and knelt so they were eye level. "Let me ask you something. If someone told you that you only had 1 year left to live, but you could spend that year in perfect happiness with the person you love most in the world, would you take it? Or would you say, no, it's not enough time, it's not worth the pain of losing it? That's not the same thing." "It's exactly the same thing. You're asking me to give up the best thing that's ever happened to me because it won't last forever." "But nothing lasts forever, Margaret. My father was young and strong, and we thought we'd have decades with him. He was dead in 3 days. Thomas was 22 with his whole life ahead of him, gone in an instant. The only certainty in this world is that everything ends, everyone dies, everyone loses the people they love." He took her hands in his. "So the question isn't whether we'll have enough time. The question is whether we'll waste the time we do have worrying about when it will end, or whether we'll live every day we're given as fully and completely as we can." "I'm so afraid," Margaret whispered. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid of being lost. Afraid that your mother is right, and I'm selfish for holding on to you when you could have so much more with someone else. There is no one else. There's only you, and I would rather have 20 years with you than a lifetime with anyone else." He pulled her close, holding her as she finally let herself cry, great, shuddering sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. "I'm not going anywhere, Margaret. Not now. Not ever. You're stuck with me." She laughed through her tears. "Promise?" "I promise." They held each other in the lamplight, two people who'd found each other against all odds and logic, determined to build something real and lasting from the ruins of their separate griefs. Outside, the new cattle lowed softly in their pastures. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight, new people to prove wrong. But tonight, they had each other. And that, they both knew, was enough to weather any storm the world threw at them. The 60-day deadline loomed like a thundercloud on the horizon. Every morning, Caleb and Margaret rose before dawn and worked until exhaustion drove them to bed. The cattle thrived under their care, growing fat on the rich grasses of the newly opened pastures. The ranch hummed with purpose and life in a way it hadn't since Thomas died. But purpose and hard work weren't enough to satisfy the bank's demands. With 2 weeks remaining, Margaret sat at her desk calculating and recalculating their position. The numbers hadn't changed. Even with the new cattle operation showing promise, they didn't have $15,000 in liquid assets. Not close. "We could sell the herd," she said one evening, her voice hollow. "Take a loss on the purchase price, but it might be enough to satisfy the bank." "No." Caleb looked up from the harness he was mending. "We sell the cattle, we're right back where we started. Worse, actually, because then we've proven their point, that we're unstable, that our plans were foolish." "Then what do you suggest? Because unless you've got $15,000 hidden somewhere, we're going to lose everything in 13 days. The helplessness in her voice cut him to the bone. He set aside the harness and crossed to where she sat, surrounded by ledgers and mounting despair. "We go back to Judge Caldwell," he said. "We ask him to intervene with the bank, make them see reason. Harrison already helped us once. I can't keep asking him to save us from every crisis. This isn't about saving us. It's about exposing what's really happening. Alice Brennan has manipulated the bank into making a terrible business decision out of personal spite. That has to be illegal, or at least actionable." Margaret shook her head. "Banks have the right to call in loans. As long as they follow the proper procedures, there's nothing illegal about it, no matter what motivated the decision." "Then we make them look foolish for doing it," Caleb insisted. "We show them, and everyone else in this county, that the Hale Ranch is thriving. That calling in your loans means walking away from a profitable, growing enterprise. We make it so embarrassing, so obviously vindictive, that they have no choice but to back down." "And how do we do that?" Caleb thought for a moment, an idea forming. "We throw a party." Margaret stared at him. "A party. A celebration. We invite everyone, the bank president, Judge Caldwell, every prominent rancher and businessman in the county. We show them the cattle operation, give them a tour of the ranch, let them see firsthand how well we're doing. We make them confront the reality that they're about to destroy something valuable because a handful of bitter women whispered in their ears. They won't come. Not after everything that's happened. Some won't, but some will. The curious ones. The ones who aren't completely under Alice Brennan's thumb. The ones who might actually care about justice over gossip." He took her hands, pulling her to her feet. "We have nothing to lose at this point, Margaret. Either we go down fighting, or we surrender quietly. Which would you rather do?" A spark of the old fire flickered in her eyes. "Fighting. Always fighting." "Then we send out invitations tomorrow." They spent the next 3 days preparing. Margaret drafted invitations in her elegant script, extending them to every person of influence in the county. Caleb worked with Joseph and Martin to make the ranch shine. Fences repaired and whitewashed, the stable gleaming with fresh paint, the grounds manicured to perfection. Mrs. Chen planned a menu that would showcase the ranch's prosperity without appearing ostentatious. The responses began arriving within days. Some were outright refusals. Mrs. Pritchard sent a curt note declining, due to prior commitments. Alice Brennan didn't bother responding at all, but others surprised them. Judge Caldwell accepted immediately, as did several neighboring ranchers who'd maintained neutrality through the gossip. Even Bank President James Crawford sent a cautiously positive response, stating he would endeavor to attend if business permits. The evening before the event, Margaret stood on the front porch watching the sun set over the hills. Caleb joined her, sliding his arm around her waist. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "I want you to know that this has been the best year of my life." She leaned into him. "Even with all the fighting, all the judgment and cruelty?" "Especially because of that, because it proved that what we have is worth fighting for, that we're stronger together than anything they can throw at us." He turned her to face him. "A year ago, I was a bitter young man who thought his life was over. Now I'm standing on land I helped save, with a woman I love more than breathing, building something that matters. If tomorrow goes badly, at least I had this. At least I had you. It's not over yet, Margaret said fiercely. We're not done fighting. The day of the gathering dawned clear and hot. By noon, carriages began arriving, more than Caleb had dared hope. Dutch Carlson appeared with his wife, grinning broadly as he surveyed the cattle he'd sold them. Several ranchers from neighboring properties came, ostensibly to see the operation, but clearly curious about the scandal that had consumed the county's gossip for months. Judge Caldwell arrived precisely on time, bringing with him a surprise guest, Harrison Peterson, the banker from San Antonio. I wanted to see how my investment was faring, Peterson said with a knowing smile, and to show my colleagues here what real business vision looks like. James Crawford, the local bank president, arrived last, looking distinctly uncomfortable. He was a portly man in his 50s who'd spent his entire career avoiding controversy. Alice Brennan's campaign had clearly put him in an impossible position. Margaret greeted each guest with perfect courtesy, her grace and composure putting the lie to every rumor about her mental instability. She and Caleb led tours of the ranch in small groups, explaining their vision for the cattle operation, showing off the new stable and the thriving herd. Dutch Carlson offered unprompted praise for the quality of care the animals were receiving, which several guests noted approvingly. During the meal, served on the expansive front lawn under the shade of ancient oaks, Judge Caldwell stood and tapped his glass for attention. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "to Margaret and Caleb Turner, who've shown this community what real courage looks like. They've faced adversity with grace, cruelty with kindness, and doubt with unwavering faith in themselves and each other. This ranch stands as proof that sometimes the most unconventional partnerships create the most extraordinary results." "Hear, hear," Peterson added, raising his glass. Several others followed suit, though Crawford notably hesitated before drinking. After the meal, as guests mingled and conversation flowed more freely, Peterson cornered Crawford near the refreshment table. "Tell me, James," he said conversationally, "is it true you're calling in Mrs. Turner's loans?" Crawford shifted uncomfortably. "That's confidential bank business." "Of course, but as a fellow banker, I'm curious about the reasoning. Because from where I'm standing, this operation shows every sign of long-term profitability. The Turners have expanded intelligently, managed their resources well, and demonstrated sound business judgment. Calling in the loans of such a promising enterprise seems counterintuitive." "There were concerns about management capability," Crawford muttered, "questions about decision-making." "Based on what evidence?" Peterson's voice remained pleasant, but his eyes were sharp. "Because I've reviewed their financials extensively. Mrs. Turner's credit history is impeccable. The expansion plan is sound. The only thing that's changed is her marital status, and I fail to see how that constitutes a business risk." Crawford's face reddened. "The board had concerns." "The board," Peterson interrupted gently, "or a few influential community members who wanted to punish Mrs. Turner for choices that were none of their business?" He let the question hang in the air. "You know, James, that there's a banker in Austin who's been asking me about investment opportunities in this region. I've been telling him the local bank here has everything well in hand. But if that bank is making decisions based on social pressure rather than sound financial analysis, well, that might change my recommendation." Crawford paled. Peterson's bank was one of the largest in San Antonio. His opinion carried weight that could make or break a smaller institution. "I should speak with my board," Crawford said weakly. "Yes," Peterson agreed. "I think you should." Across the lawn, Margaret was speaking with several ranchers' wives who'd maintained a cautious distance throughout the afternoon. One of them, a woman named Helen Yates, no relation to the Mrs. Yates from the church delegation, surprised everyone by addressing Margaret directly. "I wanted to apologize," she said quietly. "My husband and we've heard all the talk and we didn't know what to believe. But seeing you here, seeing what you've built, seeing how happy you look, I realize we've been terrible neighbors. We should have supported you instead of listening to gossip." "Thank you," Margaret said, genuinely touched. "That means more than you know." "It's not right, what they've done to you," another woman added. "Making your marriage into something ugly when anyone with eyes can see that you and your husband care for each other." My grandmother married a man 15 years younger than her, and they had 40 beautiful years together. Age isn't what makes a marriage work. Love is. The conversation spread, creating ripples through the gathering. People began speaking more freely about their own doubts regarding the bank's actions, their discomfort with the social pressure campaign, their admiration for the Turners' resilience. By the time the sun began to set and guests started departing, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Several ranchers made a point of shaking Caleb's hand and congratulating him on his work. Women who'd arrived with expressions of judgment left with thoughtful faces and quiet words of encouragement for Margaret. Judge Caldwell was the last to leave. He pulled Margaret aside before climbing into his carriage. "You did well today," he said. "You reminded people that beneath all the gossip and malice, there are real lives being affected, real people trying to build something good." "Will it be enough?" Margaret asked. "I don't know, but you've given Crawford an escape route. He can reverse the decision now without looking weak. He can claim he was simply waiting to see the results of your expansion. Peterson's presence helped with that. Very clever of you to arrange it." "That was Caleb's idea," Margaret admitted. Caldwell smiled. "Edmund chose well when he married you. But you, my dear, chose even better the second time around." 3 days later, a messenger arrived from the bank. Margaret's hand shook as she opened the envelope. Caleb stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, as she read the brief letter. When she finished, she looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "They've restructured the loans," she whispered. "Extended the terms, reduced the interest rate. They're calling it a recognition of improved business prospects and long-term viability." Caleb let out a shout of triumph and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until they were both laughing and crying at once. "We did it," he said against her hair. "We actually did it." "No," Margaret corrected, pulling back to look at him. "You did it. Your idea, your courage, your absolute refusal to give up. You saved us." "We saved each other," Caleb said. "That's what partners do." But their victory, sweet as it was, came with an unexpected complication. 2 weeks later, Sarah Turner appeared at the ranch. Caleb was working with one of the horses when Joseph came to fetch him. "Your mother's here," he said quietly. "She's in the parlor with Mrs. Hale." Caleb's stomach clenched. He hadn't spoken to his mother since that awful encounter outside the post office. He found her sitting stiffly on the edge of Margaret's finest chair, looking small and uncomfortable in the elegant room. "Mama," he said carefully. Sarah looked up, and he was shocked to see tears in her eyes. "Caleb, I came to apologize." Margaret, who'd been standing by the window, moved toward the door. "I'll give you privacy." "No." Sarah's voice stopped her. "Please stay, Mrs. Hale. What I have to say concerns you both." Margaret settled into a chair, and Caleb sat beside her, their hands automatically finding each other. Sarah took a shaky breath. "I was wrong. About everything. About your marriage. About your choices. About what I said to you in town that day." She looked at Margaret directly. "I blamed you for taking my son from me, for giving him ideas above his station, for putting our land at risk. But the truth is, I was just afraid. Afraid of losing the only family I had left. Afraid that you'd replace me in his heart. Afraid that I'd end up completely alone." "You could never be replaced," Caleb said gently. "You're my mother. But I haven't acted like a mother. A mother supports her child's happiness, even when she doesn't understand his choices. A mother trusts that she raised him well enough to make his own decisions." Sarah wiped her eyes. "I heard about what happened with the bank, about how the whole county turned against you, and you fought back anyway, about how you risked everything for each other, and I realized that what you have isn't what I thought it was. It's not a transaction or a mistake. It's real love, the kind of love your father and I had before life and loss wore us down." "Mrs. Turner," Margaret said softly, "I never wanted to come between you and Caleb. I know how it must have looked, how it must have felt. If I could have protected you both from the gossip and judgment, I would have." "But you protected my land," Sarah said. You could have foreclosed when my husband died. You could have taken everything. Instead, you let me stay in my home, gave me security, and asked only that that my son—" She couldn't finish, overcome with emotion. Caleb crossed to his mother and knelt beside her chair. "Mama, I love her. I know it seems impossible to you. I know the age difference bothers you, and the way it started wasn't what anyone would have chosen. But she's given me more than security or land. She's given me purpose. She's shown me that it's possible to build something beautiful from pain. She's made me better than I was." Sarah cupped his face in her weathered hands. "I can see that. I was so busy being angry and afraid that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. You're happy, Caleb. Truly happy. And that's all any mother really wants for her child." She turned to Margaret. "Will you forgive an old woman's foolishness?" Margaret rose and crossed to her, taking Sarah's hands. "There's nothing to forgive. You were protecting your son the only way you knew how. That's not foolishness. That's love." The three of them stood together in the parlor, two women who'd both loved the man Caleb had become, finding their way toward understanding and peace. When Sarah finally left, promising to visit again soon, Caleb felt something inside him settle. The last piece of his old life had finally made peace with his new one. As summer gave way to fall, the Turner Ranch, for Caleb had legally changed his name to match Margaret's, a gesture that made her weep with joy, continued to thrive. The cattle operation exceeded even their optimistic projections. Word spread about their success, and other ranchers began consulting them for advice on expansion and management. But more than business success, something else was growing. One crisp October morning, Caleb was working in the stable when he heard children's voices. He stepped outside to find Margaret speaking with a young widow from town, a woman named Anna Brennan, Samuel's cousin, but cut from very different cloth. She had 3 small children clinging to her skirts. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mrs. Turner," Anna was saying, "but I heard that you sometimes buy eggs and vegetables from local families, and I thought—" "Of course," Margaret said warmly. "What do you have?" As Anna showed her baskets of produce, Margaret noticed the children, thin, poorly dressed, and eyeing the ranch with a mixture of wonder and hunger. After they'd concluded their business and Anna had left with more money than her produce was strictly worth, Margaret stood watching the family's wagon disappear down the road. "There are so many of them," she said quietly to Caleb. "So many children and widows struggling to survive. So many families one bad season away from losing everything, just like you were." "It's the way of this country," Caleb said. "Always has been. But it doesn't have to be." Margaret turned to him, her eyes bright with an idea. "We have this land. We have resources. We have knowledge. What if we used it to help others?" "What are you thinking?" "A school, here on the ranch, for children whose families can't afford to send them to the town school or who need to work during the day. We could teach them reading, arithmetic, practical skills. Give them opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have." Her voice grew more animated as the idea took shape. "You've always loved learning. You could teach them. And I could teach the girls skills they'll need, bookkeeping, managing a household, even running a business." Caleb stared at her, stunned by the vision she was painting. "That would be expensive, time-consuming. People might think—" "Let them think what they want," Margaret said fiercely. "We've already weathered their judgment. What's a little more if it means helping children who need it? Thomas would have loved this idea. He always wanted to teach, to give back." She took Caleb's hands. "This could be his legacy, our legacy, something that outlasts both of us." "Then we'll do it," Caleb said. "We'll build your school." They broke ground on the schoolhouse in November, on a gentle rise overlooking the ranch. The building would be simple but sturdy. One large room with windows on all sides to let in light, a fireplace for heat, and desks Caleb would build himself. Word of the project spread quickly, met with reactions ranging from skepticism to cautious approval. Judge Caldwell donated books from his personal library. Peterson sent a check to help with construction costs, along with a note praising their community spirit. Even some of the church ladies who'd condemned Margaret began to soften, unable to criticize charitable work no matter who was doing it. The most surprising support came from Sarah Turner, who appeared one morning with quilts she'd sewn for the future students. "Every child deserves to be warm while they're learning," she said simply, pressing them into Margaret's hands. By early spring, the schoolhouse was complete. They called it Dreamer's Hollow, a name suggested by Mrs. Chen, who'd quietly observed all their work. "Because," she explained, "this is a place where dreams can take root and grow, where children who've only known hardship can dream of something better." The school opened on a bright April morning, exactly 1 year after Margaret and Caleb had started rebuilding the stable that had claimed Thomas's life. 23 children showed up that first day, from families scattered across the county, children of farmers and ranch hands and widows who'd heard about the opportunity. Caleb stood before them, looking at their eager faces, and felt something click into place. This was what he was meant to do. Not just survive, not just build wealth or security, but help others find their way toward better lives. Margaret watched from the doorway, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Thomas would have stood here, she thought. He would have loved this. And in a way, he was here, in the light streaming through the windows, in the laughter of children learning, in the legacy of compassion and service she and Caleb were building in his memory. As the seasons turned and the school flourished, the Turner Ranch became known for more than just successful cattle operations. It became a symbol of second chances, of love that defied convention, of courage in the face of judgment. People stopped whispering about the age difference or the circumstances of the marriage. Instead, they spoke of the good work being done, of children being educated who'd otherwise have none, of a community being strengthened. Mrs. Pritchard never apologized, and Alice Brennan remained hostile until the day she moved to Houston to live with her daughter. But slowly, steadily, the tide of public opinion shifted. The Turners were no longer scandalous, they were respected. A year after the school opened, on the second anniversary of their wedding, Caleb and Margaret hosted another gathering. This time, it was a genuine celebration, not a desperate attempt to save their reputation, but a joyful acknowledgement of what they'd built together. The ranch was packed with guests, former students and their families, neighboring ranchers, town merchants, Judge Caldwell and his wife, Peterson and several other bankers who'd become friends. Even some of the church ladies attended, though they kept to themselves in a corner, still uncomfortable but unable to deny the good the Turners had done. As the sun set and lanterns were lit across the lawn, Judge Caldwell called for quiet. 2 years ago, he said, I stood in a small chapel and watched two people marry under the worst possible circumstances. I won't lie. I had doubts. The age difference, the financial arrangement, the judgment of the community, it all seemed like too much to overcome. But Margaret and Caleb Turner proved me wrong. They proved everyone wrong. They took a transaction and transformed it into a partnership. They took grief and loneliness and built joy and purpose. They took judgment and returned it with grace. And in doing so, they've shown this entire community what real love looks like. He raised his glass. To the Turners, may we all have the courage to love as bravely and live as fully as they do. The crowd erupted in applause. Caleb pulled Margaret close, overwhelmed by the moment. She looked up at him, her gray eyes bright with tears. Did you ever imagine, she whispered, when you were standing in that church hating me, that we'd end up here? No, Caleb admitted. I thought my life was over. I thought I was selling myself into a prison sentence. And now? Now I know that sometimes the things that seem like endings are actually beginnings. That sometimes the people we think we'll hate become the people we can't live without. That sometimes the worst day of your life is actually the first day of something extraordinary. Margaret kissed him, there in front of everyone, no longer caring what anyone thought. The crowd cheered and someone started playing a fiddle, and couples began dancing on the lawn under the stars. As they swayed together to the music, Caleb thought about the journey that had brought them here. The shame of being called the bought husband, the hollow wedding ceremony, the cold, silent house, the terrible day when Margaret had almost turned him away, the moment he'd decided to rebuild the stable, not knowing it would change everything, the first time she'd touched him with tenderness instead of distance, the battles they'd fought side by side, the victory they'd earned together. Every moment, good and terrible, had led to this. To a ranch that thrived, to a school that gave children hope, to a community that had learned to look past convention and see truth, to a love that had started as a transaction but had become something neither of them could have imagined. I love you, Margaret said against his chest. In case I haven't said it enough, in case you don't know, I love you with everything I am. I know, Caleb said, and I love you. Not because you saved my mother's land, not because you're wealthy or influential or any of the things people thought mattered, but because you showed me that it's possible to start over, that grief doesn't have to be the end of joy, that love doesn't come with expiration dates or conditions. You gave me that gift, Margaret. You gave me a second chance at living. We gave it to each other, she corrected. As they danced under the Texas stars, surrounded by friends and family and students whose lives they'd changed, Margaret and Caleb Turner knew that they'd done something rare and precious. They'd taken the worst circumstances, the cruelest judgments, the most impossible odds, and they'd built something beautiful, something that would outlast the gossip and the doubt and even, eventually, their own mortal lives. They'd built a home, a legacy, a love story for the ages. And in the end, that was worth every battle they'd fought, every tear they'd shed, every moment of pain and doubt and fear. Because they'd fought those battles together, shed those tears in each other's arms, and overcome that fear with a courage neither had known they possessed. The bought husband and the desperate widow. That's what people had called them. But the people had been wrong. They weren't transactions or mistakes or cautionary tales. They were simply two souls who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to walk into the light together. And that choice, renewed every morning and every evening, in moments large and small, was the truest, most powerful magic either of them had ever known. As the party continued around them and the future stretched out bright and full of possibility, Caleb and Margaret held each other and knew with absolute certainty that they were exactly where they belonged, in each other's arms, on their own land, surrounded by the life they'd built from nothing but determination and an impossible, improbable, utterly extraordinary love.